Thanks for tuning in to Curious Cat, the podcast that examines the shadowy space where science and the supernatural collide. I'm your host, Jennifer Holtz. Join me every week as I explore what it means to be a soul in a meat suit. Welcome to Curious Cat. A few weeks back, I showcased a retro episode, my first conversation with Derek Condit from Mystical Wares. In it, he spoke of his personal experiences with Sasquatch. One happened on a hiking trail with his daughter. I hope you caught that, his telling, and later his theory about cryptids, including Sasquatch. I've been hearing it repeated more lately, but Derek was the first person I heard say this, that cryptids are interdimensional beings. What's this mean? They jump between dimensions. Sounds like a bridge between our physical world and theirs that they cross at will, doesn't it? Let's spend the next hour diving into that compelling, complicated, fascinating space together. Okay, about that conversation with Derek Condit from Mystical Wares. He said that cryptids are interdimensional creatures. They coexist with us, intermingle, but we remain largely unaware or blind to them. Why, though? Maybe when we're vibrating low, operating in fear and anger, they aren't visible or they keep themselves invisible from us. But when we're vibrating high, they are seeable to us, or they sense our positive energy and drop their invisibility cloak for a few tantalizing seconds. Not long enough to open the camera on our phones, but they change our bellybutton perspectives in that quick instant. And if they're interdimensional, doesn't that explain the lack of artifacts they've left behind for us to find and study? That's called paws and pelts. But wait, I think I jumped ahead, way ahead. Let's start with a little cryptid 101, right? First things first, what are cryptids? I found this from the Royal Society of Biology. Find the links to it in the show notes. In the article, Darren Naish writes, Bigfoot, Nessie, Yeti, sea monsters, all terms mostly avoided by biologists and all deemed as synonymous with pseudoscience, pop culture, and wishful thinking more than biology. Throughout history, anecdotes and stories have described large animals, often considered monstrous or frightening, that don't conform to species recognized by science. These supposed animals are cryptids, and the field of study devoted to them is cryptozoology, or the science of hidden animals. Cryptozoology is not regarded as mainstream science, but while Nessie and the Yeti are likely not real flesh and blood animals awaiting zoological discovery, an argument can be made that there might still be something worthy of study there. Can cryptozoology, or its modified version, be salvaged? My interest in cryptozoology started when I was an enthusiastic young naturalist smitten with the idea that anecdotal evidence marshaled in support of certain cryptids was persuasive. While studying the subject during the 1990s, I held the view that long-bodied water monsters reported by eyewitnesses might be descriptions of encounters with unusual long-bodied whales. However, I couldn't square this with the fact that descriptions provided for these cryptids with whiskers, ears or horns, scaly skin, serrated backs, and humps It's as if people were describing all manner of different objects or providing the creatures with attributes you might imagine a water monster to have. Meanwhile, writings on the topic would amalgamate reports as if they pertain to the same thing. In the case of water monsters, for example, the accounts often described observations of swimming deer, seals, water birds, large fish, floating wood, unusual waves and and boats. I began to think that it was naive and literalist to regard cryptids as unknown animals. This view was hardly novel. Folklorists such as Michelle Murgerer and Claude Gagnon emphasized in their 1988 book titled Lake Monster Traditions, a cross-cultural analysis, that a major part of belief in cryptids comes from the cultural setting of those observing and sharing their encounters. Big deep lakes, for example, are imagined in several European cultures to be inhabited by monsters that combine the traits of monstrous fish and predatory water horses. Physical evidence that might support the existence of these creatures has never been obtained, yet the creatures are ubiquitous in the relevant cultures, even traveling with the people concerned when they move to new lands. What I think these examples show is that cryptids are cultural archetypes embedded in the way people imagine the world. So familiar is their place within this view of the world that they're expected in the appropriate locations. If cryptids exist in the cultural realm more than the zoological one, it follows that the sorts of cryptids suspected to exist should follow trends in popular culture. Among the best examples of this is the Mokele Mbembe, a mythical Congolese water monster linked by cryptozoologists to sauropod dinosaurs. This sauropod version of the Mokele Mbembe emerged during the early 1900s, a time when the sauropod skeletons were being installed in the museums of New York, London, Paris, and other places. As a result, the Mokele Mbembe, portrayed as swamp-dwelling and amphibious, is a cultural anachronism, closely mimicking the look and behavior of sauropods favored at that time, which has since been proven to be inaccurate. In that vein, take the winged monsters of the tropics, claimed in cryptozoological writing to perhaps be modern pterosaurs. They are similarly anachronistic, recalling the petrosaurs of the 1960s adventure fantasy called 1 million years BC, more than those of the paleontological literature. A cryptozoological tradition in which sea and lake monsters are interpreted as post-Cretaceous plesiosaurs is dependent on a 19th century view that these animals swam with erect necks. The cryptozoological literature functions in part as a museum of ideas and hypotheses once disseminated in popular culture. Could people's familiarity with prehistoric animals explain their observations of certain monsters? In 2019, statistical ecologist Charles Paxton and I performed a study that aimed to test this idea, analyzing 1,688 sea monster accounts dating back to the 1600s. We found sea monsters were predominantly described as serpent or snake-like prior to the 1850s. However, beyond this, they were increasingly described as long-necked and compared to plesiosaurs, a group of animals unveiled to science in 1824 and made popular to the public during the 1840s and the 1850s. Rather than arguing that certain sea monster species had gone into decline and been replaced by evolutionary younger forms that's actually been made in cryptozoological writings, our conclusion is that expectations of what sea monsters are like has been and still is based on images familiar in popular culture. Okay, sorry to interrupt his really excellent article, but this calls to mind UFO and UAP reports, doesn't it? They vary from period to period based on sci-fi trends, don't they? But back to the article. Rather than seeing a biological phenomenon, we're seeing a psychological, socio-cultural one formed from intertwined strands. These involve the way in which people perform as eyewitnesses and data recallers, how people's expectations shape what they think they see, and the cultural setting of the reporter. This cultural view of cryptozoology is not in keeping with the flesh and blood or pelts and paws view preferred by advocates of the field, and for that reason it's seen as a highly skeptical position, if not a cynical one. Ultimately, it might mean that we should abandon the term cryptozoology altogether, since there may be little to no zoology at the bottom of it. Okay, again, I have to interject because I think of the duck-billed platypus, right? Whose description at the time seemed so outrageous it couldn't possibly be a real animal until they were found in the wild. But back to the article again. I object to the idea that cryptozoologists as a whole can be tarred with the same brush. It's not true that everyone interested in mystery animal research is misguided, woefully naive, or anti-scientific. Honest skepticism, a commitment to data collection, and respect for the scientific process are present in the community as well. The idea that cryptids are somehow surviving individuals from prehistoric species is a well-known feature of cryptozoology, but those cryptozoological writings are often rife with an additional layer of speculation. When imagined in detail as real animals, cryptids often end up as radically novel members of their respective groups. As an example, one of the best-known cryptozoological popularizers, Belgian zoologist Bernard Havelmans, who lived 1916 to 2001, interpreted Eurasian ape men as nocturnal Neanderthals that had evolved a suite of novelties that made them very different from the Neanderthals known from fossil evidence. Havelmans also posited that certain African water monsters were the aquatic descendants of saber-toothed cats, and that some sea monsters were armored, plated, multi-finned basilosaurids, which is a group of fossil whales. The existence of giant long-necked seals and post-Cretaceous plesiosaurs with inflatable humps and breathing tubes has also been popular in the cryptozoological literature. These intellectual exercises belong to the field termed speculative zoology, a mostly frivolous area in which authors make speculations about evolution. This is all fine and good in works of science fiction, but is out of place in supposedly scholarly works that aim to identify unidentified animal species. The author of this article also gives us the backstory to one debunking of what was thought to be a cryptid that washed up in New York, the not-so-mysterious Montauk Monster. Mystery carcasses found on beaches and said to be unidentifiable are a mainstay of the cryptozoological literature. As a paleozoologist, trained in anatomy and versed in taphonomy, I have often been involved in the identification of carcasses that were the source of cryptozoological interest. In July 2008, a mammal carcass was discovered at Montauk in Long Island, New York. Its gray, mostly naked skin and curved beak led to a total internet meltdown. Dubbed the Montauk Monster, it was declared a new kind of animal, perhaps an alien or lab experiment. I remember that so clearly. From its hands and teeth, I identified it as a decomposing raccoon, an identity now universally recognized as correct. Numerous other examples of this sort of thing could be recounted. Mystery carcasses are typically only mysteries as long as they are not examined by experts. Once examined by the right people, they tend to become less mysterious, if not mundane. He makes great points in his article. There's certainly certainly the case that some remains are, once examined by an expert, strange looking, yeah, but might be a raccoon or an oarfish rather than something unknown. But he never says we are aware and have the physical proof of every single species on Earth to date. There's much more to discover out there, and what we call cryptid today may very well be something with pelts and paws and a scientific name tomorrow. After a quick break, I'm going to share what I found on the underbelly of the internet. What is our best proof that cryptids exist? Back in a minute.
Hi, I'm Derek Condit with Mystical Wares. I've recently published 2 books. The first is titled Shungite Unveiled. It's an FAQ and hidden insights to the miraculous mineral called shungite and how it can be used to help save the bees. It also contains chapters on shungite in healing, shungite in plants, the Shungite Grid Project, as well as ways to use shungite with animals and in construction. So it's a large FAQ or accumulation of ways to use shungite in everyday life. Then the second book I released is called Everyday Magic, and it's inspirational stories of intuition and awakening. So it's a collection of 18 short stories that I put together that can help to explain some of the metaphysical aspects of our reality that we're all experiencing. Either of these books are available at mysticalwares.com or Amazon. There's also additional information on how to help save the bees with our Shungite Beehive project. That also can be found at mysticalwares.com, and we appreciate your support.
Welcome back. I dove deep to find out if there's any proof of cryptids, and my search landed me on, Reddit, where I found an ongoing discussion about this. One Redditor asks, what are the best photographic evidences of a cryptid? And Nadim Does Gaming responded, the best photographic evidence of a cryptid I've ever seen is the Japanese wolf. The image is razor sharp and you can see every detail of this canid creature here. And they provide a link to a BBC article on that elusive wolf. And the article asks, could an apex predator thought to be extinct for 100 years still be roaming the Japanese mountains? Some enthusiasts think they have the evidence. The article continues, Hiroshi Yagi was driving through the Chichibu Tamakai National Park when the animal came up from the stream on his left, passed in front of him, and stopped about 2 meters away from his car. It showed no fear as he edged towards it, firing off several photographs. The creature was apparently unfazed by the presence of a human. Either it was comfortable being around humans or felt unthreatened because of its status as an apex predator in this habitat. This was 23 years ago, and I didn't have much technical knowledge then, says Yagi, but I felt this must be a wolf. Yagi, a keen mountaineer, spends a lot of time in the mountains around Chichibu in central Japan, but this was the first time he had come face to face with an animal he had spent the best part of his life searching for. I decided I would try and give him a rice cracker and put out my hand and offered it to him, says Yagi. I am right-handed, so I offered the cracker to him in my left, thinking that even if he bit my left arm, I'd be all right. He was right in front of me at this point. I had brought the rice cracker right under his mouth, but he didn't take it. He just stood there. I tried to see if he smelled like a wild animal, but he didn't. He had no smell. And just like a newborn baby, he had no knowledge or fear of danger. Wolves have been extinct in Japan for at least 100 years, according to scientific records. The last known Japanese wolf remains were bought by a zoologist in 1905, who sent the pelt to the Natural History Museum in London. The discoveries of bones, fur, and scat, which all appear to date from before 1905, makes the likelihood that Yagi saw a living Japanese wolf that October night seem remote. Why was Yagi so convinced that he had encountered a wolf? Because he, like many other people in rural Japan, it would transpire, had heard the telltale sign of wolves in the night many years earlier. Okay, here's some local reports. Yagi's pursuit of the Japanese wolf began about 20 years before his sighting in 1996. He was on night watch duty at a mountain lodge that was owned by a mountaineering group he was part of. It was then when I heard a howl, says Yagi. I knew that the Japanese wolf had been declared extinct since the Meiji era, which ended in 1912, but I thought an animal that doesn't exist can't howl. And so began his 50-year search for the Japanese wolf. The photographs he captured on that night as he crept to within an arm's length of what could have been a living relic ignited the imaginations of local residents after they were examined by a prominent Japanese zoologist who described the animal as extremely wolf-like, without conclusively saying the animal was an extinct wolf. While many academics remained skeptical about their existence, some experts concluded that the animals in Yagi's photos closely resembled the Japanese wolf. The animal became known as the Chichibu Yakin, or the Chichibu wild dog. My mother told me that her friend in Chichibu, a lady in her 50s, claims to have seen a wolf-like animal in her garden back in December, says Alex Martin, an American-Japanese journalist who has started his own search after hearing Yagi's story. There have been numerous accounts of sightings, reports of howling, and discoveries of purported wolf bones, droppings and fur that have led some to believe that the animal may still be alive and roaming the mountains of Japan. The Japanese wolf is often portrayed in literature and folklore as a mystical animal. The specific name of the Japanese wolf, Hodophilax, translates as pathway guardian, in reference to the Japanese legend of Okure Okami, the sending wolf or escorting wolf, who follows travelers on mountain trails and guards them during their journey. Other versions of the folklore tell of Okure Okami who attack travelers who fall or who do not act respectfully towards the wolves. The Japanese wolf is worshipped in Japan and is particularly revered in Chichibu, where many shrines pay tribute to the animals. One such shrine, Mitsumini Shrine, is said to have been founded by a prince who, after becoming lost in the midst of the mountain range while on a mission to subdue a warring tribe, was guided to safety by a great white wolf. I have been to that shrine. Modern Japanese arts and literature also pay reference to the wolf. The animated film Princess Mononoke, which is said to be based on the legend of Mitsumine Shrine, features a great white wolf goddess that raises a human child called San, played by Yuriko Ishida in Japan and Claire Danes in the English version, who becomes one of the film's protagonists. Personally, I've discovered that researching this animal involves various aspects, not only science, but folklore, history, religion, and much more, things that help paint a vivid picture of how superstition and legends were very much a part of everyday life in pre-modern Japan, says Martin. Due to the swelling popularity of Yagi's research, the intrepid researcher is now supported in his search by about 20 other individuals, all amateurs, 5 or 6 of whom are regularly active. When the pictures were made public, many other people came forward to share their stories of wolf cries or sightings, says Yagi. It was this kinship that we were not alone in our belief in what we have seen and heard that has brought together this search and now a bit of traction. It has to be this personal connection with the wolf that inspires this belief in the wolf's existence, and together we want to bring out the truth. But Yagi acknowledges that the photographs he took 23 years ago are not the definitive proof he needs. Now the research is turning to modern technology to help capture further proof, including about 70 motion-sensitive infrared video cameras set up across the mountains. About a year ago, they recorded footage of 3 deer running past one of these cameras. At first, it seemed little to be excited about, but on closer inspection, Yagi noticed the audio accompanying the images appears to have picked up the sound of a howl. We brought the recorded howl to a specialist, and he compared it to that of the eastern wolf that was kept at a zoo in Hokkaido, says Yagi. He declared with 99.5% assurance that the two were of the same animal, and I have received a certificate of authenticity for the wolf recording. Okay, the supposed howl of the Japanese wolf can be heard in a short clip on this article. So be sure to put on headphones and cue it up, and you'll find the links to it in the show notes. Yagi continues his account though. When I first heard the howl 50 years ago, I had told many people that I believed it was the wolf, says Yagi, but their logic was that if it doesn't exist, it can't be. Whereas I believe in its opposite. If it is, then it exists. And it is this disbelief in other people. It's this idea to disprove their logic that has driven me this far. Sometimes it does seem like the road is still long. Historically, the IUCN used the 50-year rule to determine whether a species or subspecies is extinct, although it's now been replaced by a more nuanced species-specific approach, which requires evidence to be collected from targeted surveys across a species range before extinction can be determined. The reality is that for some species, which are widely tracked and extensively researched, 50 years without observation is an unnecessarily long time. For others, there might have been so few sightings of the animal in the first place, it would be an arbitrarily unfair rule. For example, no Western scientists have ever seen a sawala, a beautifully long-horned Asian forest antelope, which is one of the world's rarest mammals, says Sam Turvey from the Zoological Society of London's Institute of Zoology. Information about its distribution in Vietnam and Laos is based largely on anecdotal reports by local hunters and villagers. In the case of the sawala, a handful of photos are the most that Western scientists have seen, so the 50-year rule is obsolete. In some cases, possibly extinct species might occur in extremely remote and impenetrable landscapes, which are rarely visited by researchers, and so their status remains unknown rather than necessarily extinct, says Turvey. The complexity of proving extinction is made more difficult by the theoretical challenges that you can't prove a negative. Just because you don't find a species, does this mean that you haven't looked hard enough, or in the right place, or at the right time of year, rather than necessarily meaning it no longer exists? Turvey warns that in the absence of definite accepted sightings in over a century, the continued survival of the Japanese wolf is unlikely, but not necessarily impossible. Making its survival less likely is the fact that wolves are social animals, which live in groups and make loud howling calls, which would be expected to make them more easily detectable compared to a solitary silent animal if they were still present in the landscape. This brings us onto the sticky issue of data quantity versus data quality. Sightings have been reported which post-date the last definite record, but they are unverified and probably unverifiable, so we can't be sure what was actually seen. This is the same confusing situation faced by scientists when trying to determine the possible survival of other officially extinct species, such as the thylacine and the ivory-billed woodpecker. Some enthusiasts still believe that the thylacine, more commonly known as the Tasmanian tiger, still exists. One group of amateur sleuths have been using camera traps in the southern Tasmanian forest to find evidence of its existence, and in 2017, they released a video purporting to show that animal, although the quality of that recording is anything but conclusive. Reports made by local people who live in the same landscapes of possibly extinct species should not be dismissed, says Turvey. Often, such reports represent the only source of information about these rare animals across large areas of remote habitat, which would require huge amounts of funding to survey using standard ecological approaches. Living things that appear to return from extinction are dubbed Lazarus species, perhaps the most famous example of which is the coelacanth, a species of fish that has remained unchanged for millions of years and until 1938 was only known from fossil records before a living example was found in South Africa. There are thought to be only a few hundred coelacanths left in the world, but their natural habitat in deep waters may explain why they remained undetected for so long. One sure way to put to bed the debate about whether the Japanese wolf really is still roaming wild in the mountains would be to obtain DNA evidence. This, far more than any number of pictures and recordings, could conclusively prove that the sightings are of wolves rather than domesticated dogs turned wild. But there's another possibility. Wolves are able to successfully breed with domesticated dogs and produce fertile offspring, so there is a chance the population survived beyond the date of their presumed extinction by hybridizing with local pets. A hybrid wolf dog might explain the small, docile, wolf-like animal Yagi saw 23 years ago, although in reality the crossover between wolves and pet dogs would be so infrequent that a stable population would be unlikely to survive, they add. Many large domesticated dogs are also able to produce a wolf-like howl, so stray pets which have ventured into the mountains might explain the noises locals have heard. Systematic collection and analysis of reported wolf sightings made by local people would be a very important next step to see what sort of patterns these reports might show in terms of distribution, says Turvey. Yagi agrees. If they find more evidence from their 70 remote cameras, they might better determine where to set up a harmless trap to capture one for DNA tests. 2 weeks ago, my mother informed me that she heard a series of unusual howls from the forest behind our Chichibu home, prompting me to set up infrared trail cameras in the area, says Martin. I'm waiting to see what I find. Okay, again, I put links to that article in the show notes. Click on it to see photos of that Japanese wolf, possibly Japanese wolf, and also hear the howls. There's also the Hovey photo, which is controversial in the Bigfoot community, but I find it compelling. Here's more about it in case you're like me and you hadn't heard about it before right now. From Redditor Tio Nana Cattell, I've always been intrigued by this photo of the supposed back of Sasquatch. Yeah, a picture of Sasquatch's back. Up close. I spoke with Melissa Hovey of the American Bigfoot Society personally about how she came about this photo and find her to be quite credible. The biggest critique is that it's a costume from a werewolf movie called Claude, but Melissa spoke with the costume artist from that movie and he was adamant it wasn't the same, that the costume in question was partially destroyed where this photo is visible, and there are some distinct differences that are easily determined with any critical examination. She showed me her correspondence with him. Redditors asked questions about the photo and the allegations about it being a Hollywood costume, so here's more of that thread. Asked how the site acquired the photo, here's the response. The guy had visits to his orchard a few times, so he set up a makeshift camera trap with a DSLR camera in a box where the creature would usually enter his orchard, and he set it up so he could remotely activate it when he saw it enter. At least, that's the story she told me. When asked about the only photo being such a close-up shot of the creature's back, here's the response. Supposedly, the way the trap was set up was it could only be activated once. Why he didn't use an actual trail cam or set up for multiple photos, I don't know. But I remember trail cams back then as not being nearly as good as they are today. Another Redditor, tag named Well Here I Am, said this. It's interesting because they are reported as being very aware of trail cams, with the popular hypothesis being that they see the IR that are being emitted. A manually operated camera trap capturing one would definitely support that idea. It was such an interesting conversation. So if you're squarely in the I believe camp, which is like me, then this next article will give you great hope. Written by Lacey Davis from Indiana University, Bloomington, titled 7 Species That Used to Be Cryptids. She writes, Bigfoot, Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, yeah, she has a name, the Jersey Devil, El Chupacabra, Mothman, and werewolves are just a few of many creatures that are studied in the world of cryptozoology. But did you know that some real species we know about today were once considered cryptids? Number 1, the Komodo dragon. Until 1910, stories of a giant lizard on the island of Komodo in Indonesia were laughed at by any respectable scientist. However, when Lieutenant Stein van Hasenbroek caught and killed one, things changed fast. Explorer W. Douglas Burden wasn't happy with just a dead specimen and decided to travel to the island to capture a live one. He returned to New York with a few dead specimens and not one, but 2 live Komodo dragons. The dragons were put on display at the Bronx Zoo and inspired Marion C. Cooper to write the 1933 classic King Kong. Number 2, platypus. If you weren't familiar with a platypus and looked at a picture of it, it would be easy to believe it was a Photoshop of a duck, an otter, and a beaver all put together. Naturalists, scientists, and most Europeans in the 18th century didn't believe such a creature could exist. The second governor of New South Wales, Captain John Hunter, sent a pelt and sketch of a platypus to scientists of the European community in 1798, shortly after one was discovered. Zoologist, anatomist, ethologist, and physician Robert Knox was convinced it was a hoax and that the pelt was made by an Asian taxidermist. He even convinced botanist and zoologist George Shaw, who at the time believed the platypus could not be real, but had his doubts, to take scissors to the pelt to find stitches. Several years later, though, after many expeditions, the platypus was proven to be real. Number 3, okapi, also known as the forest giraffe. The okapi is a blend of a zebra, a donkey, a deer, and an antelope. Yet its closest genetic link is a giraffe. Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries called this animal the African unicorn. Of course, Africans knew the okapi existed since these animals inhabit the forest in Central Africa. Because okapis are rarely seen and are extremely hard to find, they were classified as a cryptid for many years. In 1901, Sir Harry Johnson found an okapi skeleton and skin and sent it to the British Museum, where it was classified as a new species. Number 4, gorilla. Okay, I bet you didn't expect to see gorillas on the list. In fact, most European explorers thought that gorillas were monsters. The first attributed sighting of a gorilla by a non-African was made in the 5th century BC by Greek explorer Hanno. Most scientists today believe Hanno was describing either chimpanzees or baboons from his account. However, his interpreters called the creatures that he saw gorilla. Interesting, right? Another explorer, Andrew Battelle, recounted seeing human-like monsters visit his campfire every morning after he left for the day. Of course, he had to mention they didn't know how to put more wood on the fire to keep it going. Yet gorillas remained cryptids until 1847 when Thomas Savage found gorilla bones. He, alongside Harvard anatomist Jeffries Wyman, wrote a formal description of the new species, calling it gorilla. A decade later, anthropologist Paul du Chaillu hunted live gorillas in order to obtain specimens to be analyzed. One gorilla species, the mountain gorilla, stayed a cryptid until 1902. Number 5, a giant squid. Many people still consider the giant squid to be a cryptid, similar to most cryptids, which tend to live in habitats that are difficult for humans to find. Giant squid live in the deep ocean. The first images of a giant squid were taken in 2004 by researchers in Japan. And in 2006, scientists from Japan's National Science Museum caught a live 24-foot female female giant squid. Every few months, there's another news report of a dead giant squid washing ashore. Even though some people consider the giant squid to be a hoax, the scientific evidence says otherwise. Number 6, the Bonde Gezu. Bonde Gezu is one of the ancestral spirits of the Moni people in Western Papua New Guinea. Its ties to Western Papua New Guinea mythology made the Bonde Gezu a cryptid for decades. It wasn't until the 1980s that Tim Flannery, an Australian scientist, took the first picture of a Bonde Gezu. Mr. Flannery identified the animal as a tree-dwelling marsupial that looked like a tiny man. It has black and white fur and even walks around on 2 legs. Unfortunately, the Bonde Gezu is on the endangered species list. Number 7, kangaroo. Yes, it's hard to believe that kangaroos were once cryptids. The first description of a kangaroo was made by Amerigo Vespucci in 1499. Okay, I have to tell you something because I did some research on that. It wasn't Amerigo Vespucci that described a kangaroo first. Here's the real scoop. The first European description of a kangaroo was in 1629 by Dutch navigator Francois Pelsart, who mistook it for a large cat. And though they didn't mention Captain Cook in their article, I have to debunk a long-held myth that he and his party saw a kangaroo. They did not, in fact, observe a kangaroo in Botany Bay. I love this article, but I wanted to learn about cryptids that are so darn wild I'd never heard of them before. Listverse did not disappoint with their October 2023 article titled 10 Obscure Cryptids and Why You've Never Heard of Them. Edward Smith writes, we all know the big ones, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, Mothman, a good creepy story about a twisted, gangly figure sitting in the shadows. It's always captured the imagination, sending a chill up many a spine. These popular names aren't the end-all that be-all when it comes to cryptids, though. A cryptid straddles the line between a mythological creature and simply an animal with no conclusive proof that it exists. Bigfoot isn't meant to be magical or something supernatural. He's a big monkey whose existence has never been proven. That's all it takes. The Greekstown cow was a cryptid after all, and that was literally just a cow someone had lost track of. With a net that wide, ranging from mistaken identity to literal legend, there are far more things to have entered the modern mythological catalog than you would ever believe. So here are 10 stories of obscure cryptids. Number 10, the Fjord Ulale. The Fjord Ulale, or the beach walker, as I'll now be calling him for the sake of me writing this and you pronouncing it, hails from Iceland. Looking like the love child of a beaver and a pug, this odd creature could be seen wandering the coasts of Iceland, often being mixed up for a dog or similar animal at a distance. Creepy myths around this one take a strange turn, where it's described as having a perverted thing for sheep, often producing odd hybrids. Maybe I hit a little too close to home with that love child joke. Tales of it never really broke out of Iceland, with it being somewhat mundane and with most simply writing sightings off as being a sea otter. Number 9, the Poukai Haast eagle. A funny entry here from New Zealand is the Poukai. However, it could honestly be called a former cryptid, as it was actually ironed out as a real bird, potentially the largest species of eagle to have ever existed. Haast's eagle. At one point, these creatures standing nearly 5 feet tall, with a wingspan of almost 7 feet, straddled the line of legend. They appeared in Maori myth as a man-eating monster that could swoop down from high and snatch up other creatures in its immense claws. Unfortunately, the reason you've never heard of them is straightforward in a very grim way. The Poukai was a major victim of overhunting, being driven to extinction. The last potential sighting of these amazing birds came from one Charles Edward Douglas, an explorer from the 1800s. Douglas Douglas described them as immense raptors whose scale and stature could scarcely be believed. Shortly after seeing them for the first time, Douglas shot and ate both specimens. My God. Number 8, the Adjula. From Mauritania in Western Africa comes the Adjula, a creepier cryptid of the canine variety. This desert dog is suspected to be a rare or very out-of-place breed of wolf. At first glance, there seems to be nothing too special about these creatures, with many writing them off as an offshoot of African wild dogs. However, this doesn't hold up to the world of scrutiny, as these sightings starting in the early 90s often place them in the deserts of the Sahara, far from where those dogs would roam. So if these mysterious mutts bounded across open sands strike up questions, why no fuss? Well, to put it simply, if you throw a stone at a shelf of cryptids, you're liable to find a story of mistaken doggy identity. Wolves and dogs are everywhere, in all shapes and sizes, and prefer to move at night. They're mistaken for a new and mysterious breed throughout history, and without something to add that extra touch of panache, this cryptid is just one more weird wolf to add to the pile. Number 7, the Ohio grassman. Well, I would have thought this was an Oregon or Colorado creature, but sorry, joking aside. Taking a turn back into weird territory, we have the grassman of Ohio, USA. This creature walks on 2 legs, looks a little like a great ape, and is often seen coated in green slime, and you guessed it, grass. Sightings obviously trend toward being blamed on other large animals or even just people seen at a distance in poor lighting. You know the drill with that sort of thing. Number 6, the auklut. From the northern Arctic tundra, we have the auklut, more legend than anything else. This is the bizarre combination of a wolf and a killer whale or an orca. Beginning as a shapeshifter in the Inuit folklore, this creature was first thought up as a shapeshifter, the idea stemming from where the paw prints of wolves in the snow would stop abruptly on reaching the sea. Stories cropped up about something that would change from wolf to whale to continue its hunt. After a point when Westerners picked up that legend, this was confused into a creature that's both things at once, quite literally a 4-legged whale monster. Skepticism abounded, and any hopes as to the creature's validity quickly fell apart when these mysteriously ended paw prints were put down to ice breaking apart and drifting away, cutting the tracks of wolves in 2. Number 5, Gua Wu, the Lake Tianchi monster. About as obscure as we can get from a Western perspective, this involves a trip to Heaven Lake between China and North Korea. Big, aggressive, seal-like creatures, all in gray, wallow about in their volcanic lake home. With sightings reaching as far back as 1903, the creature or creatures are said to be huge buffalo-sized things that have been known to attack people before usually being scared off. The language barrier is the obvious reason news of this one never got far. However, it's quite a popular tale in the local region. It's a regular Loch Ness, just for a whole other culture. Number 4, air rods. Rods are a worldwide phenomenon based on strange optical illusions, typically when a picture is taken in a certain way. Fast-moving small objects like insects get stretched out on the final product. When this comes together, they give the impression of being long, bumpy, living creatures that only appear in still images. Thus, the theory of the rod was born. It's a doozy why you've never heard of this one. Rods are a very technical thing. Hardcore cryptid fans are really the only people who pick up on them. Number 3, the devil bird. Screaming through from Sri Lanka comes the devil bird, something halfway between folklore and simple wildlife. This owl cryptid made its way into local lore for one simple reason. It's noisy. It's really, really noisy. With detailed reports going back hundreds of years, locals reported banshee-like cries at night, linking them to oncoming death. As for why he's on the obscura side of things, we can put that down to the cries and indeed the rare sightings of the bird matching some of the local wildlife. After all, no matter how you spin it, it's just an owl with a very noisy nightlife. Number 2, the scrimsel. And we're back to where we started. For such a small country, Iceland's got a lot of myths to go around. And that's not getting started on all the sightings of elves. That's a whole nother list, they say. The scrimsel has been reported several times, but one particular sighting in 1862 made for a detailed description. Over 40 feet long with a bulbous body with no flippers or fins. It's like an amphibious snake crossed with a seal. While it's more than likely that the group of farmers who reported this were simply seeing some seals playing in the water, Alfred Newton, the man who took their testimony, found it oddly detailed. While this sighting was particularly vivid and detailed, with multiple witnesses backing each other up, it was one of very few, consigning its odd appearance to an obscure track record. And number 1, the abominable snowman. Okay, wait, who hasn't heard of that? Oh, but then I have to keep reading because it says the deep sea abominable snowman. Okay, that's weird. The article reads, "No, you read that right. This is as obscure and odd as it gets, and I feel almost lucky that I stumbled across this while researching for this list." In 1968, Bruce Montour, a diver based in Miami, described his experience of testing a new diving suit. The only thing I can really do is quote you his words directly from the journey and let the image come to mind. He said, "I went lower to get a good look. It turned and looked at me at a 20-degree angle. It had a monkey's face with its head protruding out in front. It rotated its neck like a snake as it watched me. The eyes were like that of a human being but enlarged. It looked like the face of a monkey with specially adapted eyes for underwater vision. When it got a good look at me, it took off, using some form of propulsion that came from underneath." Monnier describes his experience, saying that he was certain it was no creature that had yet been recorded. In a disturbing summary that belies the amusing title, he said, "I think it is some unidentified species. It may be a newly developed one or a very old one we haven't seen before." Given that this bizarre encounter is the only testimony that we have of the deep sea snowman's existence, that should explain why you've definitely never heard of it. Okay, that one is plain terrifying. Remind me not to swim near Miami. So cryptids, how do we contact them? I began this episode sharing Derek Condit's experience and his theory of cryptids, which is shared actually after I did even more research with Native Americans from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. If we go down that path, that these are interdimensional beings, how can we up our odds of seeing one? Well, I turned to Creepypasta Wiki to find an answer. Published in honor of Halloween, here's that funny post titled "The Beginner's Guide to Contacting a Cryptid." The writer says, since it's Halloween, I thought I'd share a small legend that occasionally makes its way around town where I live. There's a lot of dense forest here in Seattle, and people like to tell stories about a tall, hairy creature that walks between the trees at night. There's lots of Bigfoot rumors around here, but they say it's definitely something else, more like the Michigan Dogman or some kind of werewolf. The big difference is that it has an animal skull for a face with sharp rows of teeth and large empty eye sockets, or at least that's what people say. You see, the legend says it doesn't like to be watched. and it recognizes and avoids all kinds of cameras. The story goes that it lives deep in the forest near Seattle and Bellevue, watching hikers from a distance and feeding off deer and wild berries. These food sources can be inconsistent, which leads to the main risk that I'll get into after the instructions. Most reported sightings are around Coal Creek, so that's probably where you'll want to go if you're looking for it. That's also where it gets the most common name, the Coal Creek demon. Some people say that it's a vengeful thing from a long-lost mining settlement that used to be there, but that sounds a bit too melodramatic for me. I'd say it's probably the result of some freak accident, but I'm not a scientist or anything, so who knows? And I have to giggle because I've stomped around that part of Coal Creek in Washington State many times by myself, and there's definitely a weird feeling there. In fact, my daughter Bryn and I found we did this hike and there was this old abandoned mining community that definitely had a very weird vibe. It was muddy and we tried to make our way up to the cemetery, and Mother Nature was kind of eating that cemetery. It was very, very odd. There are also rumors that there was a vicious fight between the miners and the managers, and there was a bunch of racism that was running rampant, and there was a fire. There was tragic deaths, which of course is associated with all mining. But this is where the creepypasta says, if you want to contact a cryptid, this one in particular, this is your required supplies. You'll need a gift, which they describe below, camping equipment, flashlights, blindfolds, a remote activated light source. Some of these items are only necessary for certain approaches, so you can read ahead and decide what exactly you need to bring. Here's their instructions. Step 1, prepare a gift. This could be a metal token or some kind of trinket, but it's usually recommended to bring a nice meal consisting of red meat and berries. This is a very important step because without a gift, it most likely won't show up. And if it does show up, you need to leave immediately. Step 2, set up camp deep in the woods. If you can still see lights from other structures, you aren't far enough. Step 3, put away all recording devices and limit your light sources to flashlights. Step 4, set up your remote activated light source a few feet away from the edge of your camp and place your gift next to it. Keep the light switched on for now. Step 5, sit back and relax. Once the sky is pitch black, you just need to wait for a sign. Feel free to chat and play games with anyone you brought along with you, just as long as you all have a clear view of the tree line. Step 6, eventually you might realize that something is observing you from a distance. It could be a tall shadow in the distance, the snapping of foliage, a sudden unnatural silence, or just the feeling of being watched, if you believe in that sort of thing. If you notice any of these signs, it could very well mean that you've made contact. You're now ready to move on to the next step. Step 7, stop all conversation and remain silent. Switch off the light next to your gift and make sure your flashlights are pointed away from it. This is also where you need to pay close attention to these instructions, as any mistake past this point will cause the demon to panic, which can have very dangerous consequences. Step 8, the demon should now approach your gift slowly. Stay calm and avoid any noises or sudden movements. Do not shine a light or take out any recording devices. If everything is done correctly, it will take the gift and briefly gaze at the people in your camp. This is the point at which most would be content to stop. So if you've had enough, just stay in place until it makes a small bowing motion with its head and walks back into the forest. If you're an idiot like my friend, you can continue through these next steps and potentially get a much closer encounter. Oh my God. Step 9. While this creature is near your camp, quickly eliminate all sources of light and put on your blindfolds. This is where it comes in handy to be using flashlights. Step 10, the demon will now feel free to explore your camp and inspect you up close. Oh my God, they're ridiculous. Step 11, wait until it loses interest in you and walks away. I love it because isn't it going to try to eat you? Because aren't you fresh meat? It's such a fun post that they put up. It's based on the writer's real experiences and it's mixed with a bunch of their imagination. Other sites I found that were trying to be more factual say when you're searching for cryptids, always have somebody else with you. Always charge up your cell phone and tell people where you're going and when you're going to return. Bring water and food with you like you would with a hike, and also a first aid kit just in case you hurt yourself or somebody with you does. It's all fantastic advice. No one I found says anything about whether or not your odds go up if you profess to believe. But if they're truly interdimensional beings, I think having a healthy curiosity and a sense of fun or amusement, not fear, couldn't hurt. Skepticism is okay too, of course. Good luck and let me know if you encounter anything. Then come on the show and tell us your story. Thanks for listening. Until next week, stay curious. I love you.